Hi, we're about to start the webinar, looking at how financial controls and technology can help keep the fraudsters at bay and what might be the right solution for you. The most common types of fraud and how to identify it quickly when things are going wrong. People are just joining us now. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so we can see where you're joining us from, and we'll start in a couple of minutes. So, welcome. Today we've got some great experience on the panel to explore the whole topic of fraud and how tech and strong financial controls can help. Two real experts. We'll be providing you with a best practice guide and following this session, so there's no need to make any notes. Please put any questions you have in the chat and we'll try and pick them up as quickly as we can. And we'll also be running a couple of polls, so please vote in those. I'm Sue Beardmore, and joining me today are Robert Brooker, who's Head of Forensics and Fraud at PKF GM, formerly Head of Fraud at Transport for London, and an accredited counter-fraud specialist. He's been leading investigations into fraud, security breaches, cybercrime and procurement allegations in fraud risk management for over 25 years. So, Robert, just tell us a little more about PKF GM.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue, and good afternoon all. Hope you're well. PKF GM is an accounting practice. Some of you may have heard of PKF, a top 10 accountancy practice. Two arms to it in the London office where I'm based, which is PKF Littlejohn, which is your main practice of tax, corporate advisory, audit, what you would expect. And then PKF GM is a restructuring advisory, forensics and fraud arm of the business based out of London, Leeds and Manchester. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks very much indeed. Matt Lowry, Chief Revenue Officer with Approval Max. He's a specialist in GTM strategy and revenue operations. So Matt, just tell us a little bit more about you, your background, and a bit more about Approval Max.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Thanks everyone for joining as well. So my background is actually originally legal. So it's kind of interesting viewing fraud through that kind of lens when it gets towards the bad end of litigation and stuff. So I have a few experiences with that. Then moved into software, kind of jumped around accounting, tech, a couple of apps, and then landed at Approval Max only about 6 weeks ago. So still fairly fresh to Approval Max, which is great. And as you say, kind of lead up the sales and CS teams there. About Approval Max, so kind of global accounting tech app that looks after kind of making your in-house financial controls a bit more robust.
Very much indeed. Thanks for the two of you. We're going to kick off with a poll about which fraud situation your particular APP might have faced. So we'll get the poll up in, there it is, and just choose whichever have applied. So duplicate invoices, employee reimbursement, fraud expense report, billing schemes, subcontractor scams, theft of confidential accounts payable data, and or check fraud such as check counterfeiting, interception and forgery. And if you want to take a couple of minutes to think about that and indicate which ones might have affected your team. We're not put a time scale on this, so just anything that you've come across. Duplicate invoices, employee reimbursement fraud or expense reports, billing schemes, subcontractor scams, theft of confidential accounts payable data, and check fraud such as check counterfeiting, interceptions and forgery. And I think we'll be getting on and close to that in a moment. The result. Okay, so a little of everything. And duplicate invoices, there are a lot of people that come up, and confidential accounts payable data, not so much, but everybody's come across some of it. Thanks very much for joining in that. So to stop all of that, or to try to stop all of that, let's look at financial control. So what exactly are they, and how do they impact fraud and accounts payable teams? Perhaps Robert, you'd like to kick us off with that.
Of course, financial controls, as I think majority of the people on here will know, and I'm interested by the response of the poll and duplicate invoicing, which kind of tells us in our world something about it. But financial controls, policies, procedures aimed at ensuring accuracy and integrity of the financial information, and obviously that helps to play a role in fraud and detecting it, preventing it. What do we mean by that? What are we referring to? Let's take expenses as an example. We know that expense fraud is rife, and at the moment, with the way that fraud is, unfortunately, we all know that fraud is absolutely prevalent at the moment throughout business, regardless of your size, regardless of your industry. And ultimately, if we've got a policy in place, then actually we've got something to be able to prevent and detect what we're doing, because we're telling people exactly what that means. And that goes across the whole of financial controls. For me, policies and procedures is robust governance as a minimum that we should expect all organizations to have. And that should not be any doubt across all the board. Everything we do should be documented, and it should then be shared, not just with us, but our supply chain in how we intend to work. And then obviously in turn, our consumers or our customers should know exactly what we would do. And for me, they do play a crucial role, because ultimately, if without it, then unfortunately you've fallen at the first hurdle.
Do you come across, and maybe Matt wants to join in the conversation, do you come across situations where people have, in theory, the controls, they've got everything set up, but they don't use them as well as they should? So people still get, most organizations will have something written down, won't they? But not necessarily operating them properly.
I agree, and I'll leave Matt to join that. I agree with you entirely there, Sue, because ultimately what we're referring to is that policy is just a piece of paper. If we don't educate and make people aware what the policies and the procedures are, and what the expectations are, and the responsibilities of those individuals with regards to those policies, then all of a sudden we've lost, and it's known as tone at the top. The tone at the top dictates the culture of the business. I don't just mean the chief exec for tone at the top, I mean the non-execs and the execs, and we ensure that we have the policies and procedures. If you fall foul of it, then unfortunately there are consequences for that. Sorry, Matt, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Any policy on anything really, any procedure, any kind of handbook, if it's it's not really worth the paper it's written on, or I guess the cloud it's typed into now, if it's not followed. And again, it's about setting that culture, leading by example, and having that educational culture where everyone's aware of why the policy is in place, the repercussions of the policy, and everyone's encouraged to stay on top of it. So I think it is that kind of continual culture, because the other thing I've seen happen just across the board with policies in general actually is, big launch event. Yeah, we've got this new handbook, this new policy. It's great. You do this one-off training. It's like, right, tick in a box, 2 years later, 6 months later, new employees join, people forget, all goes out the window, and then something like this happens, and they're like, oh, how could this have possibly happened? Well, because it's not that continual training piece to make sure that the policies and procedures are actually being followed.
And back to Sue's point, is updating it as and when you have an incident that leads to a breach is actually how can we now learn best practice, and what can we implement to tighten that to ensure that there are controls in place to prevent the fraud. If we just now move on and look at the next slide, and we'll talk about the recent IFOL survey that they've undertaken with regards to it was called the IFO Fraud Research Report. I'm sure many of you have seen it. If not, highly recommend to have a look. It was quite insightful, really, when you look at something of this nature. Internal fraud activities your company has been a victim of in the last 3 years. Now, 54% of all accounts payable teams have experienced internal fraud. I'm surprised. I thought it would be even higher. But ultimately, we could well have that, and please don't take that as a criticism. I'm not a fraudster, so I won't be looking to defraud even more of you. But if we look then at, interestingly, expenses fraud, as I've already alluded to, and supplier kickback schemes and embezzlement, both around 57 and 56%, and 14% of emailing spoofing for ACH, which, for those of you who aren't US-based, is the automated clearinghouse, so the equivalent over here of BAC. But ultimately, we got the expense fraud, as I say, we've spoken about kickbacks. I mean, anybody working within procurement, anybody whether they're working within the procure to pay transaction knows exactly what a kickback is, whereby it's basically a bribe, if you like, for a better word or a different description, whereby people are offering money in return for suppliers to get onto a scheme with yourselves and to actually win work with yourselves. And it's really quite often and very, very common. Back in the day, it used to be the scene of a brown envelope, and you might refer to it as that. In this day and age, obviously, the fraudsters are a little bit more cleverer than just handing over a brown envelope with cash on the grounds that none of us use cash. But that's neither here nor there. I think probably the idea of it is, unfortunately, it could be a holiday. It could be tickets to a sporting event, a concert. It could be some building work on your house. Or they buy the materials for you doing your building work. There are many things that obviously constitute a kickback. And Matt, what are you seeing yourselves over at over at Approval Max with regards to this?
Yeah, I think obviously read the same report, and lots of actually really good insights there, which I'd recommend people go check that out for sure if they haven't yet. But I think on the operational side, it's becoming increasingly common actually, and obviously that's not a great thing. So people have to remain more vigilant. Just not even B2B, but just as an aside, literally Saturday, I got a monster notification that someone was using the card and all that sort of stuff's happened to me personally, in terms of a website taking details. So it happens quite a bit. Specifically on the expenses one here, it's as someone who gets a lot of expenses through from the team, I know how kind of tricky it is sometimes to just, oh yes, you know, if you don't again follow that process. So it does happen, unfortunately, quite a bit.
It does indeed, and as you say, expenses is huge. And what we're noticing is obviously the insider risk is huge at the moment, which is your staff, as well as contractors and suppliers. But ultimately, the insider threat is your staff, your employees, whether full-time contractors or temporary staff. And unfortunately, desperate times call for desperate measures. So people will be putting in excessive expenses claims or completely fake, made-up expenses claims. And this is where it's all good being on via a spreadsheet or via just a hand response going through all of the receipts, etc. But if you introduce some AI and introduce a piece of software to manage your expenses, and there are some great products out there that just manage the expense using ICR, which is the new method as opposed to OCR, reading the invoices, reading the receipts, seeing where people have changed or altered, and you will see that people are deleting lines. I.e., it might be it was a meal for two, when ultimately your own policy says you can have up to £50. And so we then take it from there. So if we then move on to the next slide, and we'll look at another part of the IFOL fraud research report, which is the external fraud activities your company has been a victim of in the last 3 years. And as you see there, 69% of AP teams have experienced external fraud. So what I think you'll see is an increase over the next year or two of internal fraud while we're in this current cost of living energy crisis. Because as I say, I think that's the biggest risk at the moment. So we've got duplicate invoicing, which we alluded to earlier, which is obviously matches what you guys put within the poll at the very beginning, followed by equally cyber attacks and email spoofs and billing schemes and false companies. And the false companies and the billing schemes, I think, is really quite common, as we say. And then at the end, we've got a bit of check washing again, please. That's obviously US based. And they still have a number of checks out there. I had this conversation yesterday. It's not as prevalent over here because obviously we don't issue as many checks from our banking, and a lot of companies don't receive checks or don't even accept them. But it still is there, and obviously we all know what that means: altering of checks, or the check's not actually even from the company. And that's the same as the cyber attacks. How many of us right-click on an email address to make sure who it's from is actually who it says? So if you look internally, an email spoof may be from your director of finance, say, pay this invoice immediately. You probably know he doesn't speak like that, but ultimately you might think, oh dear, pressure, Friday afternoon. That's when they come through. That's when the fraudsters do it. They're looking for the weakness in your controls, and somebody just clicks on it, and before you know it, you've ended up sending money, account diversion fraud, bank mandate fraud. You've ended up sending money to somebody who shouldn't be receiving it. It's the fraudsters. And the only time you'll find out as a business is when your genuine supplier contacts you to say, we haven't been paid invoice 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, unfortunately, it's too late. Nothing you can do about it. You'll be insistent you've paid it, and the truth of it is the money's gone straight to the fraudsters. What happens with that money? It's dispersed from that account. That account is set up in that anything that's received in that account, by the way, they never pay anything out of it, is automatically transferred to numerous different accounts. And by the way, it won't surprise you to hear, majority of those accounts are held in jurisdictions that we have no control over whatsoever.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me yet.
Yes, thank you, Sue. That's far better.
Brilliant. That's fabulous. So let's move on to say, are any businesses more at risk than others? You know, or is it just across the board, and are some things more prevalent in some places than others? What do you think about that?
I think it's there in the title, isn't it? Everyone. Please don't think anyone's immune to fraud. And I mean this in your personal life as well as in your business life. We all think it's the vulnerable and the elderly. It really isn't, and there's many examples of that isn't. And that's the same in business. As it says there, big companies are at risk because of the volume of transactions. It's a bit like banking, isn't it? And we talk about the fraud and APP fraud within banking. We can't really expect the banks to pick up every single transaction based upon the numerous that we have. And then obviously smaller companies are targeted as they believe there are no controls in place. And that's what the fraudsters will look for, is look for the weaknesses in these organizations. And let's be honest, there's a saying, isn't there, around fraud, and there's two types of fraud, and it's high volume, low value, or high value, low volume. Now, if you put that into perspective, why would I nick £1 million off of one person when I can steal £1 off of 1 million people? We've all got the control framework in place for the million. Doesn't matter what size business you are. What we don't have necessarily, because we don't pick it up, back to what we're talking about here throughout the whole of the financial transactions and the whole of your accounts payable, we don't have anything in place for the pound, because we just...
Okay. You want to add anything to that, Matt, before we speed through some common AP frauds and maybe get your views on that? Anything to add?
Yeah, just completely echo that. I mean, everyone's at risk, as I said earlier. It's just increasing. The more things become online, email oriented, digital, etc., then you're going to have the fraudsters go through that route. The other thing I would say, just kind of towards the top of the webinar here, is the same kind of solutions that we'll get into shortly in terms of how to, tips to prevent this, also help for things which might not necessarily be fraud, but just like a misfired payment. So just by way of example, back when I was had my legal hat on years ago, the company sent a sizable amount to what they thought was the supplier, 6 figures, small company, so big supply for them, big bill going out, and it went to the wrong account. Tried to chase it up. The account was obviously went to a random taxi company in kind of rural UK. They closed the company down, and as Rob said, money dispersed, couldn't get it, and they were engaging the lawyers to try and find that. So even for those sorts of instances where it's not necessarily something as obvious or malicious, maybe it's phishing, someone types in the wrong number, you still need the same kind of tips to prevent that from happening, because it could be quite a costly mistake.
Thanks very much. So let's look at briefly the types of fraud. And I don't know if you want to, we have those up, people can see what we're talking about. I don't know if you want to pick one of those up particularly, or run through the top, some particular examples you've come across perhaps.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, obviously, we've talked about reimbursement fraud for those questioning. Is the expenses fraud? We've talked a bit about phishing. We'll talk about kickback fraud, and we talked about check fraud. Obviously, wire transfer, account takeover, all comes into what we've just been discussing. But ultimately, what do we see? What have we seen? And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I've seen recently, by the way. This is all recently within my career. As a guy who works in accounts payable, comes in as a temporary member of staff and is asked to get rid of the backlog. And with all respect to you guys on the call, I really appreciate that you've always got a backlog, because accounts payable are extremely busy and it's always that way. And he said, yep, no problem at all. But he also had autonomy. And we'll talk about this later. But he had autonomy over accounts receivable as well as accounts payable. He raised it a couple of times because he wasn't comfortable. And to cut a long story short, over a period of 17 months that he was there, he basically got fed up of seeing all these payments go through, particularly for couriers, particularly for taxi companies and chauffeurs. So in the end, and we talked about this earlier on, he draws up his own invoices for a taxi company, and they go through. They're paid, no problem whatsoever. Nobody is looking at it at all, and we'll also talk about the approval process later on too. Nobody's approving them. It just goes through. Nobody bats an eyelid. So over that 17 months, he just continually did that and got greedier and greedier, which is the normal profile of a fraudster. You go small because you try it, make sure the system works, then you get braver. And on the day he was arrested after 17 months, and when asked, he said, because I could. And that's what you need to remember. We've got all the processes in place. In this instance, the policies, the procedures fell down because we didn't have approvals. We didn't have, because do you know what? It wasn't the most convoluted of fraud. He was having the money paid into the same bank account that his wages were paid into. How many of you, just a little takeaway, how many of you compare your supply chain with your employees and comparing bank account details along with a postcode to make sure that you're not paying somebody twice? Okay, you may know about the odd person who works for you and then they've got a spouse who works for you, but actually, how often does that happen? Rarely. So I'd advise always to look at it. Just to let you know the outcome of that case, the chap got 3 years imprisonment, and most importantly about that, how much did he have in the account on the day he was arrested? All £250,000, because as he said, because I could. And he couldn't spend it. He said, I'd stand out like a sore thumb. And he wanted to make a point. And sadly, as I say, he just made a point and he went about it in the wrong way. But what it shows is the vulnerabilities we have as organizations if we're not on the ball, going back to the very first slide, with regards to our policies, procedures, and our control framework.
On to what the red flags are, what you can look out for when you're trying to detect accounts payable for the particular ones. I don't know if you want to carry on with this, Rob, or if there's anything you'd like to do.
Matt, you take this and I'll add on as we go.
Okay, Matt, off you go.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, as you can see, for me, it's about I guess managing those potential malicious actors. And as Rob says, it can come from someone who, good employee and has a bad day or whatever. So little things like payments just below the approval limit, maybe a bit of an indication that they might be trying to game the system, for instance. Again, supply price going way above or below the average, that's a kind of outside of the regular pattern of the course of business. So I think having these checks and balances, and again, someone else who's not processing the payments to check and have that oversight, I think is paramount here. And again, single supplier, more payments than usual, that goes away from the regular pattern of business. So I think keeping an eye on these sorts of changes, whether it is like an updated account code or sort code or a different email that something's going to, that should hopefully raise a flag for you to investigate so that the fraud doesn't happen in the first place.
I'll just add to that briefly, Sue. There's a saying, take 5, which is UK Finance, that many of you hopefully know and have seen their campaign. Just take 5. Think about it. Is that really genuine? Because if it seems too good to be true, I'm afraid it probably is. And when Matt there alluded to, obviously we're talking about invoicing and approval processes and limits, just ensure within your business that the people that are approving it actually have that scheme of delegation and are able to approve that amount. Because ultimately, that's how a fraud can happen. Don't forget, you need collusion a lot of the time for fraud to occur. And aggregating is really common. So that person has access, and you want to avoid the process that everybody says is really slow and painful, and that's procurement. It's not slow and painful. They're doing a job, and it's there for a reason. But if you're the fraudster and you're internal or somebody externally, it's there for a reason. It's on purpose. So what they do, they just put through 4 payments that would equate to 50,000, for instance, but they've only got a limit of 10. So they would put through 5 payments of say 9,000 or whatever, and then another of 5 to get up to the 50. And that's what you've got to be looking out for. Regular patterns, round numbers, because how often with VAT and everything is it a round number? Just some of those red flags to be looking out for. Stu.
Yeah, great, thanks. So we can look up at the next thing, which is maybe a couple of tips on what to do to prevent fraud. Your advice, you've given some things there what to look out for, and this is just general advice. So Take us through that very briefly. It's very clear. I mean, all of this is goes back to the first point you both made, that it all has to be done. It can all be set up, but it all has to be done to make it work. So take us through that.
Go on, Matt, because I think this is really your world when we start to talk about Approval Max and what it is that you're able to provide.
Yeah, sure. So I think, again, as kind of Robin, I mentioned it towards the start, so it's about, I guess, the mindset in the first instance. So you can have all the processes and courses for employees to go on, all that sort of thing. But if there's not the mindset to actually be proactive and put the work in and remain vigilant, that's all kind of worthless. It's going to collect dust. But having said that, again, if people are proactive and are kind of invested in it, and that is the cultural thing from the top down, as we mentioned earlier, then having that constant education where it's kind of front of mind at all times, people realize, the common types of fraud, the impact it could have on the business, the impact it could have, on the kind of personal reputation, professional reputation, etc. I think that's really important. As it's saying here, kind of processes, policies, again, super important. I would say even broader than some of the things on the slide, to be honest. So processes, not just for reporting fraud, but for identifying it, process for, again, who's approving what. So have all of that documented and have every new employee kind of go through an LMS system to be aware of it, as well as regular updates to that, so it remains front of mind, so that the team's aware. Super kind of detailed things that we've actually done internally. So my first day at Approval Max got a phishing email allegedly from the co-founder. Obviously it wasn't, and that was already shared on an internal Slack channel because someone else had the same email. So things like that kind of being shared makes everyone realize that it is actually more common than perhaps they think, and they're not alone in receiving that email. And then it kind of brings again that heightened awareness of what fraud is trying to do in the business. And again, as we go down this slide, payment duties authorities, to segment it as Rob said, if someone can do everything, then that's a bit of a problem, because if they have a bad day or have a change of heart or a bad actor, then that can lead the business to bad times, have different levels of authority and different people checking and multiple approvers perhaps, and also just verify the suppliers and vendors, and ideally automate the process again, but that's where the tech comes in. So I think we're going to get onto that shortly. But I think, again, have that policy, have that culture, and make it top down and really keep it front of mind within your business.
And to reiterate and just take a couple there, I totally agree with Matt. It is about education and awareness you can't get away from, okay? And it's educating and awareness, not just your staff, not just your contractors, but your supply chain. Make sure they're aware that you do have a fraud policy. What does that fraud policy mean? You do have a response plan, a fraud response plan. What would happen if something goes wrong? And I mean the responsibilities then of the employee who finds the fraud, what can they expect? The person who's being accused of the fraud, what can they expect? And obviously those reporting it, and how they're protected, hopefully under your whistleblowing policy, and how you protect them and look after them during that situation, and they don't become vulnerable to retribution because of it. And ultimately, the verifying suppliers and vendors, what does your supply chain look like upon onboarding? Now, that's whether you're onboarding customers, whether you're onboarding staff, or whether you're onboarding suppliers. What does that look like in terms of vetting and screening? Make sure you're robust at the very beginning. Don't just verify afterwards because it's too late. Get it on board early doors. What do we know about the company? What do we know about them? Can we verify everything about them? Can we look at the reviews? And what do we know? What else do we know about them as we move forward? So I can't emphasize that enough. And if you really think about it, that all fits in with the awareness and education, because you then make yourselves aware and you educate yourselves. So therefore, I'll hand over to Matt now to tell you about Approval Max and what they can do to address some of these issues we've been discussing.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks for that. So I'll keep this, really high level. If anyone is interested, we'll be in touch afterwards, or reach out to the team. There's a free 14-day trial where we can go specifically through your use case, but just super high level about the company. And I think second slide after this will be specifically about the kind of AP and the fraud prevention features. But about Approval Max, we go Xero, QuickBooks Online, and NetSuite, global companies, so work kind of US, UK, Australia, all those other markets as well. Well rated in the kind of ecosystem, and we've won a few awards along the way, which is always great. And then I think more importantly for this, the next slide will go over a few actual features and how we can help. So I think even before we get into these individual bullet points, the main benefit, the way I see it, is the fact that whenever you create your process, it's kind of enforced almost in the software. Again, if you've got a Word document or a handbook that says, oh, you must do these 5 steps, how often is someone doing their work and referring to the handbook step by step? Probably not that often. Actually, a few companies ago, I saw that firsthand, where had all these processes and then something slipped in there, and obviously they weren't that diligent on that day because they're tired or whatever. So I think the automated delegation of authority is really good for that. So you can put in a bunch of if or then logic. Up to this level, it goes to so and so, maybe up to $1,000 you want 2 people across it, or 100 grand 3 people and a director. However you want to kind of formulate it, you can, but it's really nice to have that in the software because you can't bypass it unless you're one of the administrators.
But what we will talk a little bit more about Approval Max. I don't want to interrupt you too much, but it would be interesting to see what accounting software teams around the table today are using. So if we could just have a quick poll, if you don't mind, Matt, and then we'll see, and we'll talk a little bit more about what things can do and what's appropriate for what business is. So which accounting software is anybody who's joined us today? What are the teams using? Xero, QuickBooks Online, NetSuite, SAP Concur, or something else? We can't find out every last variation. So that's some of the popular ones, and just to see what else. So if you could tell us what your teams are using, and then we'll resume discussions about what happens and other things that Approval Max can help you with. So let's see what the result was there. Okay, so you two are experts, will know more than I what they're expecting and whether that's what you come across by and large. So interesting.
Yep.
Matt,
Yeah.
over
So
to you.
it is interesting.
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt the flow, but is there, before we talk a little bit more about Approval Max specifically, can people get tied up with the wrong software? Can they use something that's simply not appropriate for their businesses? And do they use that?
Yeah, in my opinion, any software needs to be fit for purpose, and just because someone, again, it's interesting being in a sales role and understand all these events like AccountX and QuickBooks Connect and XeroCon and stuff, because you come around and everyone will be like, yeah, this is the perfect software for you. But I think until you actually try it, test it out, align it with your processes, have your team use it, that's where the proof's in the pudding for me, which is against why the trying it out and really testing software is super important, regardless of what type of software that is. The other thing I would say is similar to the process point that we made earlier about having this process and never reviewing it. You have to review the software as well to make sure that it remains fit for purpose. You're still getting the value out of it, etc. So yeah, I think there's no real off-the-shelf thing that fits anyone, but I think that's the same for any software under the sun.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So to add to what you were saying generally about Approval Max, how does that work with what companies might have in place already? What do you go in and look for when people come to you to help with particularly the fraud detection and managing?
Yeah. So we kind of match it to the process. So whatever you want your approval process to be, you map that out in our software. Again, we integrate with Xero, QuickBooks Online, and NetSuite. So where those softwares perhaps don't have as extensive approval workflows, that's where we can kind of come into it. Beyond that, again, it restricts access to the general ledger, which is important because then it can go back to someone to approve. And again, you can put in quite a robust process there. There's also an audit report, so you can see exactly what has happened. If anything did take a while to approve, or anything was out of the ordinary, that will be flagged in that report. Bill duplicates. So if you see too expensive come through, whatever it is, it will actually flag that in the software. We actually have a very specific fraud prevention feature itself, which is based on essentially flagging any change. So if something is changed in the general ledger, so let's use zero as an example, if it's changed in the zero after it's been approved, you get notified of that. And again, that's quite an important thing, because you've already approved it in state A, it moves to state B. You might not want that paid because it hasn't gone through the proper approval process yet. So things like that, yeah, just super important. There's some other things you can see on the screen there in terms of approvals and matching bills to POs. But I think those for me are the kind of main takeaways, that it automates a lot and it'll flag discrepancies for you that alert you to something that you can then dig into with your team.
So basically, this is technology backing up all that, looking out for red flags, looking out for unusual things. Rob, what do you think of how this looks, how this might work?
It's great, isn't it? And we've touched upon an awful lot of this today. And we've talked about transaction monitoring, the screening and vetting, the controls process, the policies and procedures. I'll just add, we've touched on an awful lot of it. There's a couple of points just to add on. I think the assurance and audit piece is huge as well. We've talked about the audit report that we get, but it's always important after you've had an incident, or even after you implement some changes, have an audit. It's always good to reflect and understand where you are at that matter in time, and whether that would address the weaknesses that have been exposed, or whether indeed the new policies or procedures reflect the changes that you're making, and whether it's all very well, as we've discussed the whole way through, having it in writing, does it work in principle? And then the other for me, and we've not really talked about it today, but ultimately, do you actually understand what your risks are? Who's undertaken risk assessments or just risk workshops, whereby you sit there and say, right, in your job, where do you have concerns? What keeps you awake at night? Where do you have concerns that you could commit fraud? Because ultimately, your staff know better than anyone where the weaknesses may be and where you can commit fraud. So all of a sudden, if we know where our risks lie, we know how to manage those risks and we can mitigate against them. And then obviously those that we can't, we have some concerns and we need to tighten up, whether that be a framework, whether that be controls, whether that be just the way that we interact with either our transaction process or the way that we interact with our consumers or our clients, or indeed our customers, or indeed our own staff. It means that we can then firm up exactly where we are and look at it. So always, and then manage those risks and know what the impact would be on you, because it's not just financial. Please don't think it's just financial. It takes years to build your reputation in your organizations, and unfortunately it could just disappear overnight.
So you're saying this looks to address all the issues that you might come across in a fraud, but like the policies, like the documentation, everything needs putting into place and working properly. What's your advice on implementing something like this?
Matt, I think that's for you, and then I'll follow you.
Yeah, sure. So I think again, any technology to prove max, no exception to that. If it's about matching it to your process and having that feedback loop, so you need training on it, and that's something which the provider should be giving you. There's also the buy-in from the team, and again, this kind of goes to what Rob was just saying there as well, where if you get the team to buy into it and they're aware of it as well, and they provide you with the feedback on any software, then that's really good, because they'll be in the weeds a little bit more perhaps than you might be, and they can provide that feedback, so you know where any potential weak points are, any areas of improvement are, that you can feed back to the software provider. So I think that's the kind of the main takeaway. The other thing I would say is, depending on the size of the implementation or the rollout and the size of your particular business or firm, you can do it in stages. So I'm always kind of adverse to, I call this the big bang approach, where like day one, everything's supposed to be done and ready and everyone's already using it. You kind of need to phase it out gradually, so you can iterate on how you're implementing it and rolling it out, maybe with an initial group of 3 or 4 or 5, and then you can roll it out from there across the course of the next few months.
Okay, quick word from you, Robert.
Just for me, it's making sure the product's agile. Make sure it's fit for your purposes, not just an off-the-shelf product that you think is going to work. And unfortunately, it could be a square peg and round hole. And for me, we can't beat continuous monitoring throughout the whole of that system. Make sure we are continuously monitoring and we're fully aware of where our transactional risks lie.
Thanks very much to both of you. Well, that was a quick skim through everything. I know that you're both available to answer questions if people want to get in touch with you. So many thanks to Robert Brooker from PKFGM and Matt Lowry from Approval Max. And thanks to you for joining us. Sorry, we had a couple of problems from me personally today. But for more information on membership of IFOL and courses, please just head to the IFOL website. And this webinar will be available on demand on the IFOL website from tomorrow. Share it with any colleagues that you think might be interested. We'll send a link to top suggestions and a PDF best practice guide. Thanks again, and cheerio, Rob and Matt.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. Thank you all for listening. I hope it was of some help.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.